They never heard the planes overhead. They never saw the ships offshore, and they certainly never imagined their own government might be using them as test subjects. During the Cold War, as paranoia spread like wildfire, something darker was brewing behind closed laboratory doors. Ordinary Americans' families, children, even hospital patients were walking through invisible clouds that carried bacteria, viruses, and deadly spores, not from an enemy nation, but from secret US experiments designed to test biological warfare. From the 1940s to the 1970s, strange mists appeared over San Francisco. A subway system in New York was deliberately contaminated. Even hospitals were quietly dosed with bacteria to study how diseases spread. Thousands of unsuspecting citizens became part of one of the most chilling scientific programs in American history. But here's the haunting question. How much did the government truly know about the risks? And what if some of those experiments never really stopped? This is the story of secrets buried in classified files, of tests gone too far, and of ordinary people who became unwitting soldiers in an invisible war. And what you're about to hear will change the way you see history forever. The mist over San Francisco began on an ordinary morning, the kind of morning where fog hung low over the Golden Gate Bridge, wrapping the city in its cold, familiar embrace. People went about their routines, commuters hurrying across the bay, shopkeepers unlocking doors, children chasing the gulls near Fisherman's Wharf. No one noticed that the mist felt different. In the early hours of September 1950, the U.S. Navy quietly deployed a ship just off the coast USA. From its deck, technicians released a fine spray into the wind, millions of tiny bacterial particles drifting invisibly toward the city. The operation had a code name Cispray. The Navy claimed it was harmless, a simple test to study how a biological attack might spread over an urban area. But what they didn't say, what no one in San Francisco knew, was that the bacteria they released, Serratia marcescens, could infect human lungs. Within days, the city began to stir with unease. A man named Edward Nevin, a local hospital patient, developed a mysterious infection. It spread quickly through his body, ravaging his heart valves. Doctors were baffled. The strain they found in his bloodstream was rare, so rare, in fact, that it had almost never appeared in hospitals before. But Edward wasn't the only one. Reports trickled in of strange illnesses, pneumonia-like symptoms, unexplained fevers, a few deaths. Most doctors chalked it up to coincidence. After all, who could imagine their own government might be behind it? Meanwhile, deep inside Navy laboratories, the data was pouring in. Scientists celebrated. The bacteria had spread exactly as predicted, carried miles inland by the bay's winds, dispersing evenly across neighborhoods. The experiment was a success. No one had noticed. For years, the truth stayed buried in classified files. Life went on in San Francisco. The fog returned each morning, and people breathed it in without a thought. Until one day, decades later, a document was declassified and the city's quiet past began to scream. The revelation came like a thunderclap. Operation Cispray, it read, had indeed been a large-scale biological test conducted on American civilians without their knowledge or consent. Nearly the entire population of San Francisco, over 800,000 people, had been unwitting participants. When this came to light in the 1970s, outrage erupted. Families demanded answers. Journalists flooded the city, digging through hospital records, interviewing survivors, uncovering new layers of betrayal. But the government's response was chillingly calm. Officials insisted that Serratia marcescens was harmless. They denied responsibility for any deaths, including Edward Nevin's. Yet one medical expert's testimony told a different story. He revealed that the same bacteria used in the experiment had since been found to cause infections, especially in people with weakened immune systems. The city's fog had carried more than just moisture. It had carried sickness. The more investigators uncovered, the darker it became. San Francisco wasn't the only city tested. Between 1949 and 1969, the U.S. military had conducted over 200 similar experiments across the country, prying bacteria, releasing gas, even contaminating air ducts in public buildings. Each revelation led to another question. If the Navy had tested San Francisco, where else had they done it? Who else had been exposed? And why were so many of the records still missing or marked top secret decades later? As survivors grew older, their anger turned to disbelief. Edward Nevin's family filed a lawsuit against the government, but it was dismissed. The court ruled that military personnel were immune from liability for discretionary functions. In other words, the government could test its own citizens in the name of national security and no one could be held accountable. But there was something even more disturbing buried within the testimony's whispers of a deeper network of experiments. Some hinted that the Navy's tests weren't merely defensive, that they were studying offensive capabilities. How far could a bacterial cloud travel? How fast would it spread in a city filled with wind tunnels and narrow streets? Could it wipe out a population before anyone realized they'd been attacked? Inside the laboratories, these weren't moral questions, they were scientific data points. And yet, not all scientists involved agreed with the silence. In the mid-1970s, a former technician, his name still redacted, in documents leaked fragments of evidence, to a journalist, he claimed that after the success of sea spray, the military approved new projects under different names. Cities like New York, St. Louis, and Minneapolis were next. It was no longer about defense, it was about control. As the fog rolled in over San Francisco one evening, a local radio station replayed the news of the declassified files. People stood frozen in their living rooms, staring at the dial. The mist outside their windows suddenly felt colder, heavier, tainted for many. It wasn't just the bacteria that made them sick, it was the betrayal. They had trusted their government to protect them, not to use them as lab rats in a secret war. And yet, beneath the outrage, one terrifying question lingered. If Operation Sea Spray had been only the beginning, what else had been released into the air, unseen, across the United States? The records that could answer that question. Many of them remain missing. To this day, the story of San Francisco's invisible invasion would be the first thread in a web of secrecy stretching from coast to coast. Because, as one city breathed in that deadly mist, hundreds of miles away, another experiment was already being prepared, a project that would ask men of faith to face disease itself, in the name of patriotism. And this time, the subjects would know exactly what they were signing up for. At least, that's what they were told. Operation Whitecoat, faith, science, and sacrifice. The desert was still at dawn. Only the low hum of generators broke the silence. In the distance, the sun rose over the barbed fences of Fort Detrick, Maryland, the beating heart of America's biological warfare program. Inside, a group of young men stood in white uniforms, not as soldiers, but as test subjects. Their mission wasn't to fire a weapon, but to breathe one. They were called Whitecoats. Most were devout Seventh-day Adventists, men of faith, who refused to bear arms but still wanted to serve their country. They believed in healing, not killing. So when the army offered them a chance to participate in defensive medical research, they agreed. What they didn't know was that they were stepping into one of the most secretive and morally great chapters of Cold War history. In a sterile chamber, one volunteer adjusted his mask. He could hear the hiss of pressurized air behind the glass. A voice crackled through an intercom. Test commencing in 5, 4. The next sound was a mechanical click and then silence. Invisible particles filled the room, swirling around him. He was told it was a harmless simulation, but later his fever spiked to 104. The army doctors took notes. Every cough, every symptom, every drop of blood. For years, these tests continued over 2,300 human experiments between 1954 and 1973. The pathogens varied: Q fever, tularemia, Venezuelan equine encephalitis, each capable of incapacitating or killing. The stated goal was noble: to create vaccines and treatments in case enemies used biological weapons. But the methods were chilling. Inside Fort Detrick's high-security labs, scientists grew pathogens in flasks, stored them in glass vials, and sealed them behind triple-locked doors. The Whitecoats were brought in one by one. Some inhaled infected aerosols, others were injected. They were monitored around the clock, confined to isolation wards. Nurses in full gear entered with trays of food, avoiding direct contact. At first, many volunteers trusted the system. They were told every precaution was taken, that no one had ever died, that they were heroes protecting America from unseen enemies. And for a time, it seemed true. Many recovered after days of fever and pain. Some even developed immunity. But rumors began to circulate, whispers among soldiers, about accidents in the labs. One technician reportedly fell ill after a containment breach. Another was found unconscious near a cooling unit. The official reports were vague: exposure incident, subject recovered. Yet, in nearby hospitals, Unexplained infections were quietly appearing among workers' families. Outside the gates, no one knew. The people of Frederick, Maryland, lived their quiet suburban lives, unaware that just a few miles away, clouds of pathogens were being tested on animals, sprayed from canisters, and studied in conditions one mistake away from disaster. One former whitecoat, years later, described it like this: "We believed we were saving lives, but sometimes it felt like we were gambling with souls." The deeper you go into Fort Detrick's records, the harder it is to separate defense from experiment. Many of the tests conducted there mirrored the same studies used to build offensive capabilities: weaponized anthrax, botulinum toxin, plague bacteria. In theory, it was research to develop countermeasures. In practice, it blurred the line between medicine and warfare. By the mid-1960s, the military's obsession with biological control reached a fever pitch. The Pentagon wanted to know exactly how diseases could spread in battle conditions. That's when the field tests began. Codenames like Big Buzz and Dropkick. Swarms of infected insects were released over mock towns. Balloons carrying bacteria drifted through the air. Scientists measured wind direction, humidity, and infection rates. The results were shocking. Under the right conditions, an airborne pathogen could cover an entire city in under 2 hours. It meant one thing: if an enemy could do it, so could the United States. But the faith of the whitecoats began to falter. Some grew sick and never fully recovered. Others suffered recurring fevers, joint pain, or chronic fatigue. The army denied any long-term consequences. All subjects recovered, the reports claimed. Yet the men who lived through it told a different story: night sweats, weakness, strange recurring illnesses that haunted them for decades. One volunteer, decades later, stood before Congress, his voice trembling. "We were told it was harmless," he said, "but I buried 3 of my friends before 50. The revelation cracked open a national debate. Were these men patriots or victims? When reporters confronted military officials, they insisted the program was ethical, fully voluntary, and critical to national defense. But leaked memos painted a different picture: pressure to recruit, fear of dishonor for refusing, and an undercurrent of manipulation hidden beneath the patriotic gloss. And then came the most disturbing discovery of all. Declassified documents revealed that while Operation Whitecoat was ongoing, parallel tests were being run without consent in civilians, in open air, across American cities. The whitecoats were the willing face of a program that had already experimented on the unwilling. The public never knew how close the connection truly was. Fort Detrick scientists who infected volunteers in the lab were the same men overseeing field releases like Operation C. Behind their moral shield of volunteerism, they had already perfected the art of testing the nation's vulnerability, using its own people as data points. Years later, some of the surviving whitecoats gathered at a reunion in Maryland. Many were proud of their service. Others carried quiet guilt. They prayed together, not for forgiveness, but for understanding, hoping the pain had meant something, that it had prevented future suffering. But as one elderly man whispered to a journalist that day, if it was truly about defense, why did they need to test it on us at all? No one ever answered. Fort Detrick eventually shifted its focus to vaccine development and public health research. But the ghosts of the program lingered in the families who lost fathers, in the sealed files that remain redacted, and in the uneasy question of how far a nation will go to defend itself from unseen threats. And yet, as the whitecoats era faded, a new kind of experiment was already taking shape. Not in remote labs or isolated chambers, but in the very veins of America's cities. In 1966, a team of scientists carried briefcases filled with bacteria into the crowded tunnels of the New York subway. They blended into the rush hour crowd, moving unnoticed through the maze of humanity. When the train doors closed, one of them tilted his case slightly and released a cloud of invisible particles into the air. Millions of commuters took a breath. The city had just become the next living laboratory. The subway experiments it began. Like many New York stories, in the morning rush, the air was thick with the familiar rhythm of footsteps, the screech of trains, the echo of voices calling out station names. The year was 1966. The Cold War still held America in a vice of fear. Yet, on that October morning, the threat wasn't coming from Moscow or Cuba. It was already there, riding the same trains as millions of unsuspecting New Yorkers. Deep beneath Manhattan, a man in a dark overcoat stepped onto a crowded platform at 23rd Street. In his hand, a black briefcase. To everyone else, he was just another commuter. But inside that briefcase was a device designed by the U.S. Army's Special Operations Division. It contained Bacillus subtilis, Nigra bacterium considered safe, but with one purpose: to mimic how a biological weapon would spread in a confined space. The man placed the briefcase down, casually opened the latch, and stepped back as the door slid shut. Within seconds, a fine, invisible mist filled the car. Each droplet carried microscopic life, drifting through the air vents, settling on clothing, skin, and hair. By the time the train reached the next stop, the experiment had already succeeded. Over the following days, scientists hidden among the passengers collected samples from air ducts, stair rails, and turnstiles. What they found astonished them. The bacteria had traveled through the entire subway systems, spreading miles from its origin point. Within hours, it had reached Queens, the Bronx, even Brooklyn. One tiny release had covered a city of 7 million people. No one knew. No one felt a thing. Officially, the operation was codenamed a study of subway microbial spread. It was meant to help the military understand urban vulnerability. Unofficially, it was proof of concept that a biological attack could cripple a metropolis in a single morning. The scientists, who called themselves observers, recorded everything: the density of air, the number of commuters, the humidity. They studied the subway as if it were a living organism, one that could inhale, exhale, and circulate infection. To them, the city was a breathing machine, and they had just tested its lungs. One of those scientists, decades later, broke his silence in an interview. He spoke quietly, almost regretfully. "We were told it was harmless," he said. "But when you watch people sitting beside you, breathing in what you just released, you start to wonder where the line really is." The subway experiments weren't isolated. Between 1949 and 1969, the U.S. Army conducted at least 239 open-air biological tests across the nation, from the streets of New York to the skies above Washington, from the harbors of San Francisco to the cornfields of the Midwest. Every test left behind invisible traces: bacteria on walls, in soil, in the lungs of millions who would never know. In the years following, unexplained illnesses began appearing in medical reports. Strange infections, respiratory conditions in children. Hospitals called them anomalies. Yet, the timing and locations often mirrored the Army's secret test sites. Coincidence or consequence? That question would haunt investigators for decades. Back in 1966, the scientists filed their final report. It was deemed a success. The bacteria had spread beyond expectations. The subway, they concluded, was a nearly ideal dispersal system. The data was sent to Fort Detrick, classified, and locked away. The public would not learn of it for another 10 years. But there was something darker hidden within those documents, something never released in full. The bacteria used in the experiment, though considered non-pathogenic, had been linked to infections in people with compromised immune systems. It was a technicality buried under the language of bureaucracy. On paper, it was harmless. In reality, no one truly knew. As years passed, whispers grew louder. Scientists who had worked at Fort Detrick began to talk about Project 112, an umbrella program that tied together dozens of tests, not just in cities, but on ships, in the air, even over rural towns. One of them recalled that the subway test wasn't meant to be a one-time event. It was part of a larger simulation plan. The Army wanted to see if multiple bacterial releases could mimic a nationwide epidemic. For those who uncovered this history later, one question cut through the noise: why test on Americans? The official explanation was always the same: national defense. To protect against possible Soviet bioweapons, scientists needed to understand how such an attack might unfold. But beneath that justification lay a darker logic. Real data required real conditions. Controlled experiments could never replicate the chaos of a living city, and so, civilians became the unwitting variables in a grand, invisible equation. A mother in Brooklyn would later recall, decades after reading about the tests, how her son fell ill that autumn. High fever, cough, strange rashes that doctors couldn't explain. He recovered, but she never forgot it. "Maybe it was just the flu," she said, "or maybe it was something else we were never meant to know." The declassified files were filled with technical terms and charts, but between the lines lay human consequences. The people who breathed that air, the doctors who treated the unexplained, the scientists who stayed silent, and the families who would one day read the words "unwitting subjects" in government documents. and realize that meant them. By the 1970s, when journalists finally exposed these tests, the nation was reeling from other betrayals: the Vietnam War, Watergate, the CIA's MK program. Trust in authority was crumbling. So when Americans learned that their own government had experimented with biological agents in their cities, disbelief turned to outrage, but the response from officials was coldly procedural. All materials used were harmless, they said. No evidence of harm has been found. The public wanted reassurance. What they got was silence. The documents that could have proven otherwise were either destroyed or heavily redacted. Even the names of the scientists remained blacked out. The truth dissolved, like the mist they once released, seen for a moment, then gone. Yet one detail survived, tucked away in a forgotten appendix. It mentioned a second phase, an extension of the subway trials, that was never publicly confirmed. It hinted at another city, another experiment, one that may have gone further than anyone admitted. The note ended abruptly, the final line cut off mid-sentence. Historians who stumbled across it later said, the missing words might have named the next location. Others believed it referred to a hospital, not a city, a place where experiments moved from air to flesh. The answer lay not in the subway tunnels, but in the sterile hallways of America's own institutions, and what happened there would make the subway tests look almost merciful. The human petri dish hospitals are supposed to be sanctuaries, places of healing, of mercy, of second chances, but in the shadowed corridors of mid-century America, some hospitals became something far darker. Not sanctuaries, but laboratories. It began quietly, far from the headlines. Doctors in crisp white coats, clipboards in hand, spoke softly to patients too weak to question. Consent forms were vague, explanations even vague. We're testing a new treatment, they'd say. Just a routine study. The patients nodded, trusting the voice of authority hovering over them. They didn't know that their bodies were about to become test chambers for biological agents, many of them. The same strains once sprayed into city skies. In one hospital ward in Manhattan, the air felt unusually cold that winter. A group of elderly patients, recovering from surgery, began to develop strange infections. The doctors seemed unusually attentive, collecting samples, whispering in corners. One nurse later recalled a chilling instruction: don't talk about what we're doing here. It's classified. Years later, investigators uncovered that this was one of several hospitals quietly cooperating with military researchers. The goal wasn't to heal, it was to observe. They were studying how bacteria behaved in vulnerable human systems, how infections spread in closed environments, and how different dosages produced different reactions. In plain words, they were experimenting on the sick and the dying. At the University of Pennsylvania, a ward was sealed off under the guise of infection control. In truth, researchers were introducing new bacterial strains to test antibiotic resistance. In St. Louis, hospital staff were told to administer substances whose true contents were known only to the scientists in Washington. Patients trusted that they were receiving medicine. In reality, they were breathing in the next phase of biological warfare research. The justification echoed the same refrain. Defense: we must be prepared for enemy biological attacks, they said. To defend, we must first understand. But that defense came at a human cost. In the 1950s, a new phase of testing began on prisoners. Inside federal penitentiaries like Holmesburg in Pennsylvania, inmates volunteered for medical research in exchange for small stipends or reduced sentences. They were told it was harmless. Many believed it. Few realized they were being deliberately exposed to pathogens, radiation, and chemical agents. One prisoner, Alan M., later described the day he was taken into a testing room. The walls were lined with metal trays and glass vials. A doctor told him it was a simple skin test, that he'd feel only a mild irritation. Within hours, his skin burned and blistered. The infection spread up his arm. When he begged to stop, the doctor told him he was too valuable to pull out now. His scars never fully healed. Government reports would later describe these tests as voluntary, but letters unearthed from the archives told another story of coercion, misinformation, and desperation. Many inmates couldn't read the consent forms. Some signed simply to escape boredom. Others didn't sign at all. At the same time, across the Midwest, strange clouds appeared in the sky. The military called it Operation Large Area Coverage. They released zinc cadmium sulfide, a fine fluorescent powder. to track how particles dispersed over cities like St. Louis and Minneapolis. People living below saw the haze drifting through their neighborhoods, never knowing they were breathing in a toxic chemical. Years later, residents of those same neighborhoods began asking questions. Why were cancer rates rising? Why had so many children fallen ill? When the truth emerged, the explanations were painfully familiar. It was harmless, officials insisted, necessary for national security, but nothing could explain why poor, predominantly African American, neighborhoods had been chosen as primary test zones. Each revelation pulled back another layer of deception. The subway tests, the San Francisco spraying, the hospital experiments, they weren't isolated incidents. They were all threads in one chilling web of research. The U.S. Biological Warfare Program. And at its center was Fort Detrick. Documents later showed that Fort Detrick, scientists weren't only developing vaccines, they were testing the same pathogens in humans to measure their effects. Many of these pathogens were harvested from overseas laboratories, including samples from Japan's infamous Unit 731, the same wartime unit that had experimented on prisoners of war during World War II. The irony was brutal. US had condemned Japan's biological atrocities, and then quietly used their data to advance its own. The deeper investigators dug, the more grotesque it became. In some hospitals, aerosol chambers were used to expose patients to airborne bacteria under the pretense of infection studies. In others, contaminated medical equipment was introduced to observe how infection spread within wards. And yet, the public never knew. In 1976, when a journalist tried to publish a story linking Fort Detrick to hospital experiments, he received an anonymous call warning him to stop. "You don't want to end up sick yourself," the voice said. Days later, his notes were stolen from his car. The article never ran, but truth has a way of resurfacing. In the early 2000s, researchers reviewing old medical archives began noticing patterns: unexplained infection clusters, odd strains of bacteria that didn't match known hospital contaminants. Each one traced back to the same decades, the 1950s and 60s. A hidden chapter of history was beginning to re-emerge, and through it all, one haunting question persisted. How many people had died without knowing they were part of an experiment? No official number exists. The records were shredded, the data buried in national security files. What remains are fragments, handwritten notes, testimonies, faint traces of guilt, and the voices of those who once believed they were doing good. One retired microbiologist, Interviewed, in 1981, paused for a long time before speaking. "We told ourselves it was for defense," he said softly, but after a while, defense and offense started to look the same. The lines blurred, the ethics vanished, and America's laboratories turned their gaze inward. Citizens became test subjects, trust became a casualty. And yet, even after the outrage, the lawsuits, the investigations, something strange continued to happen. Unexplained outbreaks in military hospitals, classified research contracts under new names, funding streams quietly redirected to biomedical innovation. It was as if the experiments hadn't ended at all, only evolved. The official shutdown of open-air biological testing came in 1969, when President Nixon publicly announced the end of America's offensive bioweapons program. Cameras flashed, reporters applauded, but deep in the basements of Fort Detrick and other research centers, the work went on, now hidden under new titles: biodefense, public health preparedness, pathogen countermeasures. Same labs, same scientists, different names. And in one of those labs, just months after the announcement, a freezer malfunctioned. Several vials thawed. The records say the material was neutralized safely, but an internal memo, later leaked, told a different story. It mentioned possible exposure and containment breach. No further details were ever released. The official response was silence. The silence of machines humming behind locked doors. The silence of men who'd seen too much. The silence of those who still believed that to keep a nation safe, the truth must stay buried. But buried truths have a habit of resurfacing. And when they do, they tend to leave scars. Because what happened next, when the cover-ups began to crack, would finally expose just how deep the deception went. The cover-up and the legacy. The first crack appeared not in a laboratory, but in a courtroom, a small hearing room in Washington, D.C., packed with journalists, veterans, and quiet men in dark suits. It was 1977, and the world was about to hear for the first time the scale of what had been done in silence. A congressional investigation had uncovered something extraordinary. Over 200 covert biological and chemical experiments had been carried out on American soil, many of them without the knowledge or consent of those exposed. For decades, these operations had been justified under the banner of national defense. But as the names of the projects were read aloud, white coat, big buzz, dropkick, the words felt less like science and more like betrayal. Among the witnesses sat families from San Francisco, men who had been soldiers at Fort Detrick, even a few former scientists. One of them, trembling, admitted what few had ever dared to say aloud. "We tested on our own people," he said, "and we told ourselves it was necessary." The room fell silent. The hearings revealed that many of the tests had been approved at the highest levels. Internal memos showed generals signing off on feasibility studies involving bacterial dispersal, public exposure trials, and medical monitoring. One document even contained handwritten notes from Pentagon officials discussing how to minimize public concern if the operations were discovered. For the first time, America was forced to confront an impossible question. How could the government, sworn to protect its citizens, have turned them into subjects of biological warfare experiments? Public outrage exploded. Newspaper headlines screamed of secret germ tests on U.S. cities. Talk shows debated ethics versus necessity. Lawsuits flooded federal courts. Yet, behind the scenes, the machinery of secrecy kept moving. Many files were missing, others destroyed. The official line was simple: no one was harmed, and everything had been done for defense. But not everyone accepted that answer. A young journalist named Linda Forrester began chasing the trail of classified documents that had somehow survived. She tracked down former military technicians, scientists, even nurses who had worked on routine exposure studies. One of them, an elderly woman named Martha, revealed a chilling memory. She described being ordered to incinerate medical records late one night. When she hesitated, her supervisor told her, "You don't want this kind of history following you home." The destruction was systematic. Reports were sanitized. Sample data was redacted. Yet fragments of truth slipped through the cracks. One surviving file mentioned Project SHAD, shipboard, hazard, and defense. The tests had involved spraying ships and crews with biological simulants in the Pacific Ocean, supposedly to study how well Navy vessels could withstand an attack. Decades later, sailors who had served aboard those ships began falling ill: respiratory diseases, strange cancers, autoimmune disorders. The government denied any link, but the patterns were unmistakable. The deeper Linda dug, the more she realized that the story wasn't about the past, it was about the present. The same laboratories that had conducted Cold War experiments were still active, now working under new titles like biodefense and public safety research. Fort Detrick was no longer a weapons lab, at least officially. Yet, in its deepest levels, researchers still handled pathogens that could wipe out cities. Anthrax, Ebola, Marburg. The names had changed, but the purpose had not. Even more unsettling were the new players: private contractors, biotech firms, and defense agencies working together in secret. Billions of dollars flowed into programs designed to study biological threat preparedness. And once again, the line between protection and experimentation blurred. In 2001, after the anthrax letter attacks, Fort Detrick was thrust back into the spotlight. The spores used in the attacks were traced back to the same strain once developed inside its labs. The official investigation concluded that a lone scientist, Dr. Bruce Ivins, was responsible, but not everyone believed that. Some suspected the incident was connected to ongoing biodefense testing, a modern echo of the same experiments that had begun in the fog of San Francisco 50 years earlier. The ghosts of the past had returned. Across America, survivors of earlier experiments demanded recognition. Families of those affected in San Francisco, St. Louis, and New York called for apologies. The government responded with vague statements of regret, but stopped short of admitting wrongdoing. Compensation was denied. Accountability vanished into bureaucracy. And yet, despite everything, fragments of hope surfaced among the ruins. The exposure of these experiments forced changes in law, stronger ethical guidelines, oversight boards, and the birth of the Belmont Report, which established the modern principles of informed consent. Out of darkness came reform, but it came too late for the thousands who had already suffered. Still, the most haunting revelations were not the ones in the hearings, or in the documents but in the missing pieces. Whole projects referenced in memos with no attached reports. Codenames with no explanations. One particularly cryptic reference appeared in a declassified index. Operation Nightfall. Location, domestic. Status, ongoing. No details followed. No records ever surfaced. Linda tried to find it, scouring archives, interviewing aging scientists who refused to speak on record. One, in the final weeks of his life, gave her only a single line. Some things, he whispered, were never meant to end. That phrase stuck with her. When she finally published her book, The Secret Cloud, it sparked national debate. Critics dismissed it as conspiracy, but survivors saw it as vindication. For the first time, ordinary Americans understood that biological warfare wasn't just a foreign threat. It had been tested in their own backyards. But one final discovery changed everything. While reviewing old Fort Detrick procurement files, Linda found a series of contracts issued in the 1990s to companies developing aerosol dispersal systems technology eerily similar to what had been used in the 1950s. The description was vague, couched in phrases like rapid deployment, pathogen delivery for simulation training. The last listed project date was 2018. If the experiments had truly ended, why was the technology still being refined? She brought her findings to a retired intelligence officer. He listened in silence, then leaned forward and said quietly, "You think those experiments stopped because of morality? They stopped because they didn't need the public anymore. Now they can simulate everything digitally, or so they claim." Then he paused, his eyes narrowing. But sometimes, simulations require validation. Linda left his house that evening unsettled. Outside, a faint mist was rolling in, carried by the evening wind. It shimmered under the streetlights, harmless, ordinary, familiar. And yet, after everything she'd learned, she couldn't shake the feeling that some truths still drifted unseen, floating just beyond reach, because history had proven one thing beyond doubt. Once a government learns it can test in secret, it never truly forgets how. The files may be buried, the names may be changed, the buildings may be repurposed, but the question remains, lingering like the invisible fog that started it all. Are we sure it ever really stopped?